This week on The Wheelhouse. Ice out. As enforcement ramps up, the kids are speaking up. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse, the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond, right here. Around the corner from the studio, students at the Classical Magnet School in Hartford staged a protest. They walked out of the classroom and greeted passersby with signs. Those signs were directed at federal law enforcement agents. The action came as a wave of student walkouts were organized across America in response to recent killings of civilians by ICE agents in Minnesota. This hour, we'll hear from students who want ICE outs, or at least we'll hear about students that want ICE outs. But before we get to that, we want to get to the latest on the developing conflict in Iran and the Middle East. U.S. and Israeli forces struck Iran over the weekend. President Donald Trump, he says the attacks are in the interest of American security. The strikes have continued since then, and lawmakers have responded, including our next guest, who says the attack happened without Trump receiving a clear mandate from the American people. Joe Courtney is a U.S. congressman representing Connecticut as a Democrat on Capitol Hill. Thank you for coming on the show, Congressman.
Thanks for having me on, Frankie. Lot to talk about.
Lot to talk about, and I'm very confident I'm talking to the right person about this. I want to know, regarding the written statement that you sent out, this was Saturday, criticizing President Trump's order of U.S. strikes on Iran for not coming with a clear mandate from the American people, from Congress, or the UN support there. How did you find out about the strikes, and what was your reaction? Kind of take me with wherever you were when you found out.
Yeah, sure. So, it was about 6:30 Saturday morning, making my coffee, and just, my phone just blew up in terms of just the latest news flashes that were coming on. So, turned on the TV. I mean, look, we've been tracking the concentration of U.S. forces that has been going on for a good 6 to 8 weeks. Again, it's really the largest flotilla of Navy warships, in one place, really going back to 1998. Some of the records that we've checked, and obviously that's also complemented by the fact that we had, huge air wings that have been positioned at U.S. air bases all over the Middle East as well. So, at some point, you knew something had to give here. The president, in his State of the Union address, which I attended, spent 3 minutes on Iran out of a 2-hour address, and didn't say very much, to be honest with you. And so, definitely downloaded his video statement that he made at 1:00 in the morning down at West Palm Beach, which, again, really tried to sort of weave together some justifications, but I didn't hear anything that struck me as an imminent threat exception to the War Powers Act. He obviously doesn't have authority from Congress, as you said, and frankly, or UN, allies in terms of them being brought in.
Imminent threat is the buzz phrase that you use there, and he's expressed concerns about Iran's nuclear program. What can you publicly say about Congress and what they know about the Iranian regime that the U.S. is trying to change now?
So again, a lot of this has been actually in the public domain for a long time. Obviously, Operation Midnight Hammer back in June, when their nuclear sites in Iran, the three major areas where they had the technology that was enriching uranium. It still was not weapons grade back in June, but anyway, it got hit really hard. The B-2 bombers, particularly that came into Natanz, they had bunker busting bombs, which are, just staggering in terms of their explosive power that's there. So, there was certainly truth to the fact that Iran has been trying to reconstruct at this point some of their program that's there. We don't have inspectors on the ground to really sort of see neutrally what's actually happening there, but there's no indication that, within a space of about 8 months, that they've been able to reassemble their program even close to what it was back in 2025. In terms of missile technology, which is not nuclear tipped or nuclear armed, they definitely have been very busy building building missiles as well as drones. The Shahed drones have been all over Ukraine, and they've been actually in play over the last 72 hours in Iran as well and other parts of the Middle East. So, I mean, they have a sizable missile force. There's no question about that. But there was no indication that the U.S. homeland was even close to being at risk in terms of those missiles. And there was no actual missile firing that was going on by Iran, over the last 2 or 3 months. There were negotiations going on that the Omani government was brokering, and appeared to make some fairly real, tangible progress in terms of trying to shrink the size of Iran's, both its missile program and its nuclear program. So, it was not surprising on the one hand because of the concentration of forces that the U.S. had built up there, but it was also surprising just because, there was nothing that actually triggered, our forces to go in there with really heavy airstrikes. That's obviously the question of the day before Congress.
You're a ranking member of the House Sea Power and Projection Forces Subcommittee. What's your assessment about our forces in the region and what's at stake?
So again, we've always had naval presence there. The Fifth Fleet is located in Bahrain. I've actually visited a couple of times there. There's roughly, about 10,000 sailors there. We have surface ships, destroyers, littoral combat ships moving in and out of there all the time. We have Coast Guard vessels that are there. You would be maybe surprised to hear that, but in fact, the Straits of Hormuz, which is right adjacent to Bahrain, is actually, the type of body of water that the Coast Guard is very proficient in terms of patrolling and, tracking what's going on out there. So the Straits of Hormuz is a place where 20% of the world's oil and natural gas flows every single day. Today, as we're talking, it has been completely shut down because of the war, and that's one of the reasons why the oil prices, the international oil prices now have jumped up to over $80 a barrel. It was roughly about $60 when on Friday evening before the strikes began. So it's a place that, again, U.S. Navy has been very present over the years, and obviously with the fact that we now have two aircraft carriers, the USS Abraham Lincoln, the USS Gerald Ford, in the proximity of the region there, along with additional naval warships that are there in bigger than normal numbers, shows that this is very much a maritime naval event that's going on there. Iran has a navy. It's roughly about 100 vessels. They're a lot smaller than U.S. Navy ships that are there, but it doesn't take much to really gum up the works in the Straits of Hormuz, and really that's always been sort of the pinch point that Iran has always posed as their way of trying to repel a strike and an invasion. And again, so far that's come into play.
I'm glad that you brought up the Abraham Lincoln and the Gerald R. Ford, those carrier strike groups that have been deployed. This is all part of Operation Epic Fury. So I'm checking out the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and at least whatever has been released publicly and kind of hearing about that. You talked about gumming up the works in the Strait of Hormuz. Is there any concern about vulnerability for this massive flotilla that's out there in the Persian Gulf at this time and in the area?
I mean, there is they've been busy over the last couple of years already, where the Houthis in Yemen were sort of taking pot shots at Navy ships in the Persian Gulf and in the Gulf of Oman, and they've had to protect themselves, you know, in terms of their sort of anti-missile technology that all the ships carry, the Aegis systems, as they're called. That's definitely very much something that I'm sure our Navy leadership is tracking very closely. But in terms of, the Straits of Hormuz and the commercial traffic, the minute there's, fighting that breaks out there, all these oil tankers that bring all this energy, through the Straits of Hormuz every single day, they immediately canceled their insurance on those commercial ships. And that is really the reason why those ships come to a screeching halt and really have stopped moving, through the straits, both backwards and, in and out. So it's that's really where the pinch point is in terms of just the world's energy markets, and that spills into the world's financial markets.
Pinch point, very important, especially when we're thinking about that Strait of Hormuz. And this, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube here. So the strikes have happened. They're continuing. What would you like to see the president do now?
Yeah, so, first of all, he really has to come clear with a plan because, there's been about 3 different iterations in terms of just, what his policy is here in terms of what he wants to see happen. I would love to see the House and the Senate exercise their, constitutional powers as a co-equal branch of government by voting in favor of the War Powers Act. The House is going to vote on Thursday. The Senate is apparently beginning the voting process tonight, or on Tuesday night, rather, in terms of, when they're going to be taking it up. So, that is a way of forcing the administration to either come to us and ask for an authorization for use of force or a declaration of war. But in either case, they've got to lay out a real policy and a real plan in terms of what are the goals here in terms of, are we talking about, again, trying to force them back to the negotiating table to concede even more on the nuclear program and on missile programs? Is it to, basically put a new government in place there, which I don't see how you can possibly do that with the Iranian security forces that are still very dangerous and very powerful. And I certainly don't think the U.S. has any stomach for putting boots on the ground for, some type of regime change. We've seen that movie far too many times in the Middle East. And I think the president is probably, savvy enough to understand that that's really a red line, in terms of the American public. So, and again, I think that, the international arena is a place that we've got to start really getting people involved to try and bring the fighting to a stop, which is, again, the Gulf state Arab countries who Iran has been firing missiles at. I think actually would be very helpful in terms of trying to get this thing, the heat turned down. And as I said, the Omani government was trying to negotiate and broker a deal between Iran and the U.S. Up until Friday of last week. So there's avenues that we can pursue. The United Nations Security Council met yesterday, and that's what it's there for. Is to have countries come forward and try and in a multilateral way rather than a unilateral way try and bring this to a halt. Because if it just keeps sort of festering, this is going to have real economic impact in terms of what we're seeing on Wall Street right now, and it's certainly going to have an economic impact in terms of people's pocketbooks with the cost of energy.
Relevant, important testimony from the congressman, and also very important strategic and tactical conversation here. That's something that I'm very happy that our listeners are learning about here. Congressman Joe Courtney, thank you so much for coming on the Wheelhouse.
Thanks, Frankie.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is the Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. After the break, we're going to discuss recent student protests against federal law enforcement at schools in Connecticut. What are teachers saying about the recent walkouts? How are folks reacting to it? You can tell us what you're saying about it. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. There's more Wheelhouse next on Connecticut Public. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. Students across America have joined adults in demonstrations protesting immigration and customs enforcement, or ICE, and Connecticut teens have taken part. Today, we are going to be joined by an administrator at the one of the CREC schools that we have here. This is Gina Chace, assistant principal of the CREC Academy of Aerospace and Engineering in Windsor. Students there have spoken out to administrators about the federal government's immigration policies. Thank you so much for being here, Gina.
Thank you for having me.
So glad to have you on, and also joining us to provide context on federal education policy. There she is, Anne-Marie Timmons. She covers local schools and governments and a senior youth and education reporter at NHPR. Thank you for joining us via Zoom, Anne-Marie.
Oh, good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Folks, what's your reaction to recent student ICE protests, students getting involved? Are you seeing demonstrations in your community? Join us on the air this morning by hitting us up on our YouTube stream or by calling 888-720-9677. A couple weeks ago, Gina, we saw students at the Classical Magnet School in Hartford stage their own protests. We also had Francis T. Maloney High School, where there was a protest after a graduate and his father were arrested and detained by ICE. Can you just help me understand kind of the temperature in schools right now as we have this sort of culture of fear where students might be worried about their classmates?
Sure. I think that it's really important for us to promote student voice, to listen to them, and to give them a platform that is both safe and appropriate, while also maintaining a robust educational environment where they can engage in civil discourse in a way that is positive and proactive and empowering.
Tell us more about ICE Out Day. And I understand that you all gauge students on their level of interest in a protest. How did they respond?
Sure. So students came to us, actually, and when, several weeks ago, there was kind of a movement happening where student walkouts were being planned. And we were really grateful that our students came to us and shared their thoughts, and they really wanted to engage in some meaningful form of protest. And so in listening to that, we felt it was our responsibility to hear them and to give them a means to express themselves in a way that was not disruptive to the educational environment, but while also keeping them safe. And so rather than allowing them to walk out and just, be outside and kind of at will, we worked with them to kind of create a walk-in. And so students were effectively given permission to walk out of their classrooms. We created space for them in some of our common spaces, our auditorium, our cafeteria. This was entirely student-led. And so students spoke. They held their own kind of internal protest. Nobody was required to attend. Students could stay in their classes if they chose to do so. But those that wanted to have a voice and engage in that process were allowed to. We put some parameters around this, around when this could happen, so that it would, again, not be disruptive to the educational environment or the day. And they were entirely appropriate, and they kind of exercised their rights.
Can you tell us about anything in particular students were saying to you all about their desire and some of the things that they're maybe hearing and then kind of bringing to your door? As you mentioned, we were talking before, you always have people coming in and out of the office, I would imagine. So what kind of things are you hearing from the students right now?
Yeah, it's a busy place. I think that they are wanting to be involved. Our students are consumers of media. They're very plugged in. They are aware. And they wanted to take part in something that aligned kind of with their values and what was meaningful and important to them. And we felt it was our responsibility to kind of hear them and to do that in a way that was acknowledging of their desires and giving them the tools to advocate for causes that are meaningful to them.
Anne-Marie, earlier in the winter, students started walking out of the classroom to protest ICE, as we mentioned. Students were then inspired by what they saw on social media, and more demonstrations took place in locales like Hartford here, like Tampa, like Northern Virginia. Student protests, were they widespread in New Hampshire? Were there a few? Were there a lot?
There were two big ones and then some smaller ones. And it's interesting to see how Connecticut responded. The schools in here, New Hampshire, were a little bit different these were not sanctioned by the schools. Students faced consequences if they went forward with their walkout. And we saw in one school district, probably 200, 300 students walk from the school to our state house to have a very public display. And in Nashua, a more diverse student body, even more people came out. And so very similar things. They had been seeing the violence in Minneapolis play out on social media. They were upset about that. And in addition, especially in Nashua, which is just a much more diverse student body, students had very personal experiences with law enforcement, either from their family or themselves because of the color of their skin. And they felt, one student said, "You look a little Spanish, you have an accent, and you are a target." And many students expressed fear about this being very close to them. And one student in Concord, his family came here from Nepal, and he said his family now carries their passports because they fear they could be stopped anytime. In addition, they're not sure the passports will be enough. So students are very plugged in. One criticism I heard from the public was this idea that the school had put students up to this, or adults had. I think it really underestimates the students, and students were upset about that, actually. This was completely student-led, and the school districts put out a statement to say, we're not sanctioning this. Students will face consequences if they participate. So it really, really was student-led here.
You said that they face consequences. That's what I wanted to ask you about, how administrators respond. What do we know anything about what those consequences were? Were they generally supportive administrators, do we know, or was it kind of a hard line?
I think school leaders were in a little bit of a difficult spot. There's been a real effort in the state to eliminate what some think are DEI, diversity, equity initiatives. And so schools are a little fearful of this right now. And so they're in a difficult spot. I think they want to support students, but they also want to not be on the radar of people who are trying to eradicate so-called DEI in schools. And so publicly, school districts were pretty firm. If you do this, you will face consequences. For some students in one district, that could be suspension. In other districts, maybe they make up the class time. And so students told me, some people are being killed for raising their voice, up and protesting ICE action in Minneapolis. A suspension to me is not, it's a sacrifice I'm willing to make. So the consequences sort of, span from maybe somewhat minor to suspension. Students did tell me that they had conversations in their districts with their leadership of schools and said, this is what we want to do. And while the school didn't sanction it, schools did arrange to have safety personnel to march with the students. So there were police officers in one district and, police officers as well as staff in another. So schools did not sanction this, did not publicly say they supported it, but did want to keep the students safe.
At CREC magnet schools in the third week of January, students take part in Racial Justice Action Week, which administrators tell Connecticut Public reflects core values of acting with courage and demanding equity. We just talked about DEI programs sort of being under attack from the federal government here. What does this programming mean to you, and what do we see from participating students each year? I know you have more than just high school students at the Aerospace and Engineering Academy. Help us understand how we might have seen it at your school.
Sure. I think the goal of Racial Justice Action Week is to help foster a more racially just world. And we sort of investigate the ways in which race and racial dynamics have shaped American history and society, both past and. And so I think in the younger grades, that starts out by looking at and celebrating differences among individuals. When we have students who are older, the issues become a little bit more complex, of course. I think the root and the focus is, what is the issue? Why is it a problem? How do we perceive it? And then what can we do to fix it? And so we see that in a variety of different ways, I think in a number of different spaces, whether it's through art or uplifting student voice or looking at, again, history and historical context and how that's contributing to our current socio-political landscape.
Are the reactions to what you all are doing with that programming, I guess whatever you're doing with your core values, are they generally positive or negative?
I think generally they are very positively received. Certainly, we serve a really diverse group of learners and families, and I think that's one of the things that makes us beautiful. And I think generally we have positive reactions.
Is there the rare occasion where, like, she was talking about it there, where Anne Marie was talking about how people in the public might say that the teachers are putting the students up to it. Does that happen? And if so, is that like from outside the community, or does it ever happen inside the community?
I think those instances are rare. I think they are the exception rather than the norm. I certainly can't say that they don't happen. It's almost impossible to please everybody all of the time, as we know. But generally, I think the reaction is overwhelmingly positive.
Can you react to what we're hearing from Gina here, Anne Marie, in the fact that we have this culture at CREC, which is really dedicated to racial justice initiatives here? It might be a little different up there in New Hampshire. I know there are school districts that want to do this, but what I'm trying to say is politically, it might not be something that is very popular statewide.
This conversation is making me realize how different New Hampshire is in this moment. I think there's public support for diversity and equity in many ways. There's confusion about what diversity and equity is. Equity can be the school lunch program that ensures students who don't have enough money for lunch get lunch. It can be special ed. So when people start to understand what equity includes, they're much more open to it. It's the leaders of our state, the Republican leadership of our state, who's very, against DEI, been very loud about that. And I have not seen schools say, we agree. I've seen schools say, we're nervous and we can't risk our state or federal funding. So we are going to protect our students, let them have a voice to the degree possible, while really trying to stay under the radar. So a lot of support in schools for their students. It's really coming from our leadership in the State House.
As we mentioned, Democrats have the majority in both, we're talking about Republicans having the majority in New Hampshire, but in Connecticut, Democrats have the majority in both chambers of the Connecticut General Assembly. Ned Lamont's a Democrat. As you just mentioned, it's not that way in New Hampshire. Connecticut and Maine, among other New England states, are outspoken about the inclusion of transgender students in sports by the gender to which they identify. That's not necessarily the case in New Hampshire.
Right. We've had, laws trying to outlaw students being treated in any way that they're categorized as a group, but it's been vague. So it's very hard to understand what that means. The most specific action we have seen is, trying to outlaw federally and with state actions, transgender students playing on a sports team that they identify with. And we've had state laws try to stop that. Our federal courts have put a pause on that while it's litigated in court. But there's been quite a bit of action around that. And we've had students tell their story and say, this is who I am. I've been playing on the team I identify with since elementary school. But they're just not sort of winning that argument at the State House.
What's happened in New Hampshire, I think we kind of alluded to this earlier, regarding the federal administration's stance on diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. It's reverberating throughout the country, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. I think what's interesting here for me is at the state level, there's quite a bit of, I would say, just really loud opposition to DEI. We've seen the state try to ban it. And of course, the Trump administration had an order back in January that said, if you don't stop your equity and initiative actions in your school, you'll lose your federal funding. And 3 or so weeks later, our local chapter of the ACLU sued on behalf of several school districts, as well as civil rights groups and a teachers union. And that case went through the courts, and the outcome was not decided by a jury or the judge, the Trump administration just said, okay, we'll back off. We're not going to actually go through with that. And in some ways it was a surprise, but in some ways it was not, because during the proceedings in that case, we saw the federal prosecutors who are here from Washington try to defend the executive order have to leave the hearing multiple times to say, we don't know the answer to that question, Judge. We'll need to call Washington. And so there was just a challenge, I think, in defending that executive order. And so when they decided to back off here on enforcing it, that affected the whole country. And so those efforts can no longer be pursued in school districts anywhere. I will say that doesn't mean school districts aren't still afraid of what could happen. There is a chilling effect that continues regardless of what happens in courts.
And that's what my next question was going to be to you. Does that mean that children still get to learn about racism in school?
They do. And school districts will say, we never stop teaching about racism. But they're still nervous about how to talk about this, because while that federal executive order has been, set aside, there are 2 state laws in New Hampshire that are being litigated in court now that very much limit what schools could say in terms of race. But the laws are so vague, and the courts have, paused these laws because they're so vague and said, we don't even know what we're not allowed to do. And so that puts it in this position of being afraid to do anything. And so they're very much struggling with what they think is right, but also trying to stay on this side of the state laws.
In what other ways are school children impacted in your state by what's happening with the administration?
I think it's primarily been this ICE activity, because that has played out on social media, which is where they're tuning in. I'm not sure they're reading the New York Times or even NHPR and seeing kind of the wider debate over diversity and equity. But what they saw in terms of attacking, in their minds, people of color in Minneapolis has really registered with them. And they're angry about it. They're scared about it. They don't understand it. And they feel like, even though they're way up here in New Hampshire, they'll say, we have to speak out. We can't be silent on this. So that's where I've seen the most activity regarding any kind of diversity and equity kind of action.
Gina, is there anything that she's saying that's sort of resonating with you, that's the students care a lot about, whether it's DEI or it's worried about other students in ICE? Is there anything that she just said in the last, or at least the fight that they're having, that is something that you all are doing, even as administrators?
Yeah, I'm actually kind of uniquely familiar with the fight. I was in New Hampshire prior to coming to Connecticut about 4.5 years ago, so I know the landscape well, and what she's describing is it resonates with me because I recall being in that position. And I think that it is important to know that our students are hearing and seeing, and they have real thoughts and feelings about what's going on in the world, and they're choosing to exercise their rights. We know that students don't shed their rights when they walk into school. And so we feel
that's actually federal law, isn't it?
It is indeed. And so we feel, we are well positioned to help support our students, and we are not facing the same kinds of pressures that they are in New Hampshire. And so it is a little bit of a different landscape here for sure.
Were you at least heartened then when you heard about the ACLU lawsuit there, or at least the fact that they were able to maybe stand up to the Trump administration for a day there?
Yes. And as much as I feel as though, in my current role, while I certainly am clear on my personal values, it is important for me to focus on my students and what it is that they need in the moment.
Any particular programming happening at CREC soon, similar to Racial Justice Action Week, or at least something that we should be paying attention to that sort of showcases what the students have learned here and their core values?
Sure. We certainly have lots of opportunities for students to advocate for causes they believe in and exercise their voice. But one upcoming event that we have on March 19th at Parkville Market in Hartford, we have our CREC Student Art Showcase, where students across the district in grades in pre-K and kindergarten all the way up through grade 12 have their art on display for the public. And it's a really, really beautiful event. So I'd encourage anybody to come down and check that out.
You've been listening to Gina Chace, an assistant principal at the high school at the CREC Academy of Aerospace and Engineering in Windsor. Thank you so much for coming on, Gina.
Thank you so much for having me.
It was terrific. And folks, students out there, hear me. If you want to learn about journalism, yes, you could listen to the New York Times. You could also listen to NHPR, particularly if you're in New Hampshire, and you will follow Anne-Marie Timmons' reporting at nhpr.org, senior youth and education reporter. Thank you so much for joining the conversation today.
Oh, you're welcome. It was great to be here.
Sometimes it's good to cheat. We're in the local classrooms at the University of Connecticut. We have them look at the New York Times and listen to Connecticut Public Radio. So maybe you got to get in the classroom over there and make sure they listen to both, Anne-Marie. Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. Coming up next, protest isn't the only form of civic engagement. Hear how students in Avon are learning about local government and policy. Listen to The Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. We've heard from a Connecticut administrator and a reporter about recent school walkouts protesting immigration and customs enforcement, or ICE. But protests aren't the only ways kids are getting involved. Chris Doyle teaches students at Avon Old Farms other aspects of civic engagement in his government and crisis class. Chris, thank you for hopping on the phone with us this morning.
Thanks for having me on the show, Frankie.
Always love talking to you, and I'm going to love talking to you about this. Folks can join us over the phone if they'd like to. 888-720-9677. If you have any questions about civic engagement or anything we talked about earlier, give us a call, 888-720-9677, and we'll try to help you out. This is sort of like going along with the question I had planned, but I changed it up a little bit because of what I just heard from Gina Chace there. She said something that actually we talked about in a pre-interview together. She said that when you walk into a school, you don't shed your rights if you're a student. Can you tell me a little bit about what that means to you?
Well, that's correct. And that actually comes from a Supreme Court case called Tinker v. Des Moines. It dates back to the 1960s when students protested the Vietnam War by wearing black armbands to class. And they were sanctioned for that by school administrators, and they ended up in the Supreme Court. And the justices decided that that was a legitimate expression of their political speech and that they didn't lose all those rights just because they were school students. And I would certainly concur with that.
Protest is one form of civic engagement, youth civic engagement. Can you just help us out, Chris, with what other forms are?
Well, in my class, my government class, I wanted the students to see how government actually works, especially state and local governments. So we had our state rep, Eleni Kavros-DeGraw, come in. We had our state senator, Paul Honig, come in. They talked about what they do in Hartford and how much power and responsibility they have in state government. We visited Connecticut Superior Court in Torrington. We went to Gardner Correctional Institute in Newtown. We served a meal at a homeless shelter in Hartford, an Immacare shelter. And we also visited our local police department, and the students are riding along with the Avon PD in small shifts.
Yeah, now it almost seems like you're bragging. That's tremendous, all the work that you all are doing there. You all are civics titans over there at Avon Old Farms. And it's not like it's only at Avon Old Farms. You've worked at other places before, so your students have been able to do this for a long time. Why is it important for the students to see government in action? And just use some of those examples that you have there and some of the experiences that they've had.
Well, first of all, I think government democracy generally right now gets a very bad rap. The idea that many people have is that government is completely dysfunctional. It's all driven by corrupt corporate interest. And I don't want to deny that some of that is a real problem, but often government works, and it works dealing with really, really difficult problems. My students, when we went to court in Torrington, they got to talk with prosecutors, they got to talk with public defenders, they got to meet with the judge, and they were all convinced that the system was actually dispensing justice in a very fair and often compassionate way. And when we went to Gardner Correctional, they met 5 inmates who were doing really long prison sentences for murder and accessory to murder. And they're in a special rehab program. But these guys, one of them had been in jail for 29 years already. And, these are people whose lives have gone really, really badly. They've done terrible things, but they're trying to rehabilitate themselves. And the corrections officers are doing a really difficult job, but they're in there pitching too. They're giving it their best every day. And, the students were really sobered by that. You're seeing life at its worst, and you're seeing a government institution trying to mediate that and improve things. And sometimes it works. And I think that's what my students came away with, was that maybe things aren't as completely dysfunctional as the media would have them believe.
What are some takeaways that they're sharing with you besides that? You talked about some people that have visited your class, like the lawmakers, including Paul Honig and Eleni Cavros-DeGraw. Any other kind of speakers you could think of that have come in there and sort of had an impact on the students?
Yeah, we have a faculty member who's in my department who's an Afghan war vet, and he spoke about why he joined the military, what it was like to serve in Afghanistan, how he feels about that experience now. Our associate head of school is a former law enforcement officer, and he came in and talked about both the satisfaction of his career in law enforcement and also the toughest day he ever had on the job. That was very moving. I got choked up. He talked about trying to console a mother whose child had just been killed in a hit-and-run accident. My wife came in. She was an ER doctor during COVID at St. Francis Hospital, and she talked about what she felt as kind of a medical and a civic obligation to go into work when people didn't really know very much about COVID, except that it was making a lot of people sick. Again, I think when you get down to the individual human level, you hear all these stories, and collectively they add up, that all of these people felt called in a certain way to see beyond themselves and to give of themselves for the greater good. And I was impressed with that, and they were too.
That is remarkable. And thank you to your wife for her service, by the way. But it's remarkable because you're really learning, if you're a student, at least my takeaway would be, and I don't know if I would have thought this in hindsight 20 years ago when I was in school and I was a lot less mature than I am now, but the takeaway might be there that everything is political, right? Because as much as we don't like politics, there is a lot of intersection, because when you are an ER doctor and things are happening in COVID, there's rhetoric that can impact the way people look at your job, and rhetoric that can impact your job because people may not wear masks, and people may, because of politics, they may not be able to sort of bend the curve because there's not this mask wearing. People may not want to wear it. You also may need politicians to help you access PPE. So are you kind of in some way also saying that this is part of local government? How doctors interface with their students is also something that, with their patients is also something that is sort of political in nature, that involves government?
Yeah. My wife made that point very explicitly, and she talked about science denial and how painful that is as a physician to have to deal with that. And in a sense, like those kind of expressions are best said by somebody who's actually a doctor or somebody who's actually in the field. It makes my job a lot easier. I don't have to say anything when I've got an ER doctor in the room saying it, to my students. We started our class kind of dealing with this right away. I had the students read some pretty ancient sources, both in favor of democracy, that was Pericles, and also against it, that was a Platonic dialogue, where Socrates says, ordinary people are just not capable of governing themselves. They'll listen to people who want to tell them what what they want to hear, and that you'll end up in a corrupt authoritarian state. So, this kind of argument about the pros and cons of democracy have been going on for a long, long time. And, Pericles said, look, people in Athens, they buy into the law because they make the law. And that's the argument in favor of it, So I hope my students come away with this idea that citizenship has to be active all the time. And if citizens are asleep at the switch or they're being fed misinformation, then it's not going to work very well.
Do you have any success stories about students? Anybody that has sort of gotten involved with local government or some kind of intersecting career that involves something that they've learned in your classroom, or even come back and spoken to the class? Any kind of success stories in that regard?
Well, those are kind of the things that teachers live for, especially
Yes.
teachers of history and government. I had 2 students in the last few years who reached out to me. One of them has just finished up at the Naval Academy, and I had lent him a memoir of a guy who was a West Point grad and went on a Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford. And this guy had gotten kind of the equivalent of that scholarship, and he'll be studying in Madrid next year. And he told me that my class made a difference. And another student ended up majoring in government rather than business because of an AP Gov class that he took with me. And he reached out and told me that he's at Harvard Law School now. So, that's music to my ears. And I'm sure those are the emails I'll save when I retire and read over in retirement. Yeah, that's nice when that happens.
I'd like more of those to pour in, because it is very important for kids to learn about civics. Is kind of what we're getting engaged in here on the Wheelhouse lately, having a lot of these conversations, but we can't do it without people like Chris Doyle, history teacher at Avon Old Forums. Thank you for your work. You all are talking to a lot of different people, visiting different places. This is something that is built over 40 years of work, Chris.
Thank you, Frankie. I appreciate it.
Today's show was produced by Tale Ricketson. It was edited by Patrick Scahill. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Thank you so much to Megan Boone for all of her work, Bradley O'Connor, and Sam Hockaday. Thank you so much to Tess Terrible, Megan Fitzgerald, Connecticut Public's visuals team, and our operations team. Download the Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse. Thank you for listening.